All right. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, so my name is Shauna Agel, and I am currently the interim program chief for Adult Protective Services. I am also an investigator and a field supervisor, and we'll be going back to that when we hire a new program chief. I have been with APS for 6 years now. I have covered, at this point, pretty much the entire state, with the exception of Bennington and Windham County. So I have traveled quite a bit doing this work. Prior to my work with Adult Protective Services, I was an investigator and a social worker for DCF, doing Child Protective Services investigations and ongoing family work. So I like to start out, and this helps since they gave me a list of who's in the room and your credentials. So who in here is a mandated reporter?
Yeah.
Wonderful. Unfortunately, I do a number of these trainings. When I ask that question, people don't know that they're a mandated reporter. So that is the first piece that I like to get out of the way. So I'm glad that you all know that. When doing this presentation, I like to ask that if you have questions going along, please ask them at that point so that we don't forget them by the time that we get finished. So just interrupt me and ask away. And then we will have time at the end, and I will give you the heads up that Alan has created a little bit of a test for the end of this.
That's not surprising.
I will make sure that I go through all of it, and I think actually the majority of the questions are answered right in the brochure that I handed you as well. So, and hopefully technology will cooperate with us. Let's see. So what is Adult Protective Services? We are a unit of state government that has statutory authority under Title 33, Chapter 69 of Vermont's Vulnerable Adult Statute. We investigate reports and allegations of abuse, neglect, and exploitation of vulnerable adults, and we operate under the Department of Disability, Aging, and Independent Living, otherwise known as DAIL, which is a branch of the Agency of Human Services. Our authority is civil in nature, which means that Adult Protective Services investigators cannot levy criminal charges against an alleged perpetrator. We don't get to arrest them, although that would be fun.
Mm-hmm.
What does vulnerable adult mean? The term vulnerable adult does have a very specific meaning, and it is determined through the intake and screening process or the investigative process. One common misconception is that Adult Protective Services only works with the elderly. In fact, a vulnerable adult can be over the age of 18. It can be an 18-year-old. Vulnerable adult is defined in statute. It is defined, again, as a person over the age, 18 years of age or older. That individual could be a resident of a facility which is required to be licensed under Chapter 71. Those are your nursing homes, res care homes, therapeutic community residences, some assisted livings. The individual is a resident of a psychiatric hospital or a psychiatric unit of a hospital. As you can imagine, this has become a little bit more difficult with the flooding of the state hospital and new psychiatric units popping up in different hospitals and potentially new hospitals opening shortly. The individual has been receiving personal care services for more than 1 month from a home health agency, which is certified by the Vermont Department of Health, or from a person or organization that offers, provides, or arranges for personal care, such as TLC. Or regardless of the residence or whether any type of service is received, the individual is impaired due to brain damage, infirmities of aging, or a physical, mental, or developmental disability. That same impairment results in the individual being unable to provide for their own personal care without assistance. and or that the same disability or infirmity impairs that individual's ability to protect themselves from abuse, neglect, or exploitation. Any questions on this definition? The rest of the definitions I won't read to you, but this is one that most people have the most questions about, so I'd like to go over it thoroughly. Abuse. Abuse is an act or behavior and conduct that places a vulnerable adult's life, health, or welfare in jeopardy, or which is likely to result in impairment of health. There are many different types of abuse which are defined in statute that Adult Protective Services investigators investigate. We do investigations and receive reports regarding physical abuse, emotional abuse, verbal abuse, as well as sexual abuse. The one piece of this definition that I do like to point out is that sexual abuse is defined as sexual activity with a vulnerable adult by a caregiver who volunteers for or is paid by a caregiving facility or program. They do separate the sexual abuse definition from sexual exploitation, which we'll get to, which is when the perpetrator is a stranger, is a neighbor, is a friend, is someone that is not in that caregiving role.
Not a paid caregiver.
And it
Or
doesn't need to.
unpaid, doesn't have to be paid.
It does
But
not
there's
have
a
to be paid.
distinction there,
There is a
so
distinction.
we don't call it sexual abuse, or we don't, or Adult Protective Services doesn't get involved in it.
We do get involved. It is, the definitions are just separate. It's sexual abuse when it's a caregiver, and it's sexual exploitation when the perpetrator is not in a caregiving role.
Like a husband.
Well, that gets a little
Might be
tricky,
care-
but yes,
Because it might be a caregiver.
it could be. But again, if it's a consensual relationship between the vulnerable adult and their caregiver, again, depending on the dynamics there, we have to tease out which one it would be, and if in fact it's abuse or exploitation at all.
That seems like a really hard area to make judgments in.
It can be, yes. Neglect. Neglect refers to purposeful or reckless failure or omission by a caregiver that results in physical or psychological harm to the vulnerable adult. And again, there are many different types of behaviors and action or inaction that may be defined as neglect of a vulnerable adult. With the definition of neglect in our statute, the perpetrator needs to be in a caregiving role. Again, it does not have to be a paid caregiver, and it does not need to be someone who works with an agency or is formally hired to be a caregiver. It can be a family member, it can be someone who has taken on that role because of the need. It can be someone who has lived there, and there's some sort of exchange for some light housekeeping for rent. This definition can get difficult. A number of the reports we've been receiving lately are around neglect when there are two elderly individuals, a husband and wife, two sisters or brothers that are living together, and one of them is providing care for the other. We receive a report alleging neglect. We really have to look at, is this in fact neglect, or is it that this individual does not have the resources, does not have the ability to provide the level of care that's necessary? So in those instances, we're going to be looking more at, how do we get services in the home? How do we make sure that this individual is receiving the level
That's
of
what he
care
needs.
that they need?
Right.
And
there is a difference.
there is a big difference.
Yeah.
Yes. So the one piece that I also like to point out with the definition of neglect is that neglect can be repeated conduct or a single incident which has resulted in or could be expected to result in physical or psychological harm. We APS does do investigations in licensed facilities. The majority of those we are looking at carrying out a care plan. Was the care plan followed? Our agency has two parts, survey and certification, which is the organization which licenses and oversees these licensed facilities. We share an office, we share a director. When the reports that we receive are of a this facility stinks nature, as I like to call them, then it's survey and certification that will go out and do those investigations and look at the regulatory concerns of that facility. If there is a specific perpetrator involved in the allegation as we receive it, then that is something that Adult Protective Services will open and assign and look at as well. Exploitation is using or acquiring money or property through harassment or intimidation of a vulnerable adult or sexual activity with a vulnerable adult when he or she cannot consent or is incapable of resisting. And again, there are many different types of financial and or sexual exploitation. So this is the big one that keeps us quite busy. I think that the economy over the past few years, as well as the increased drug problem that Vermont is currently dealing with, have both led to an increase in the reports of exploitation and, in fact, in substantiated findings of financial exploitation.
Sad but true.
It is. These perpetrators, unfortunately, are everything or anyone from a paid caregiver. They are someone who is providing services in a home or in a facility to an individual that then uses that access to take money, to take and divert medications.
Mm-hmm.
These, unfortunately, a great number are family members. We receive a number of reports, everything from forged checks to, harassing and intimidating an elderly relative or a relative with a disability, trying to get and take their financial resources for use for the perpetrator. We also see power of attorneys who have some level of authority to utilize someone's finances and resources, and unfortunately use those resources in excess of their power. And then again, the sexual exploitation, which we touched on briefly, is again, this does not have to be a caregiver. This can be a relative, a friend, an acquaintance, or a complete stranger. Any questions on any of those definitions? So self-neglect. This is yet another hot topic in the state of Vermont right now. There was recently a task force that was created to look at and research self-neglect and its prevalence in Vermont. The definition that you see there is the definition that the task force agreed upon and found was most appropriate. Adult Protective Services does not have statutory authority to investigate allegations of self-neglect. Our statute is really designed to look at incidents where there is a perpetrator involved. So when there is an allegation of self-neglect, if the report is regarding an individual who is under the age of 60, those reports currently are coming to Adult Protective Services because unfortunately there is not another agency at this point who has been identified and tasked with doing such investigations. When a report comes into APS regarding potential self-neglecting individual under the age of 60, our intake and screening staff is going to gather as much information as possible about that individual, about any potential resources that they may have, about any services that, although they may not be using them currently, that they may have previously been involved with, anyone who we may reach out to in order to assist this individual. We also utilize the field services directors, which are spread throughout the state and are and work under the Agency of Human Services. Referrals are made to those individuals when we receive reports of self-neglecting individuals under the age of 60. Reports of self-neglecting individuals who are over the age of 60 are reported to the local area agency on aging. They are the agency which does have the statutory authority, or sorry, the mandate to investigate allegations of self-neglect when the individual is over the age of 60. It's important to note, I think the Council on Aging is probably the organization which we make the most referrals to. Any individual over the age of 60 who does need resources or needs some sort of support, the Council on Aging is really a great place to start. They have case management. They can reach out to the individual in their home, in their community, and be one more person that could have eyes on the individual to either to hopefully prevent abuse or to help the abuse from continuing to occur. Reporting, when and how to make reports. As mandated reporters, you do not have to prove or be certain that a vulnerable adult has been abused, neglected, or exploited in order to make a report. If you suspect a vulnerable adult has been harmed, you need to make that report. You are mandated to do such. There are 3 ways, or at least 3 ways, to make reports to us. We have a hotline which you can call to make our report. We have do receive reports via fax. And we also have an online reporting form which allows you to fill out the report and then print that report for your records.
Well, I wish I would have known that before, way before now.
It is important to note that we have 2 individuals who receive reports for Adult Protective Services. 2 individuals who take all calls statewide regarding abuse, neglect, and exploitation. To give you a picture of what that means, the last quarter we received 1,033 reports.
Oh my gosh.
And again, only have 2 individuals who are responsible for receiving all of those reports and screening all of those reports. So,
1,000.
It's a very common thing, unfortunately.
1,033 reports
Yeah.
that were
That's
received.
amazing.
Where do you get these numbers, is my question, because I have never seen no numbers to call. On this paper there?
They
Oh,
should-
good, now that I've got them, great.
You know, if you are working in a facility, all facilities are required to have them posted and accessible.
There again, I didn't have it, but
So they are to have them available to you and posted for all residents.
I worked in a facility. I reported abuse. I was demoted, told I was trying to cause trouble.
I'm sure that's illegal.
Yeah.
It is.
I quit my job because I was so devastated. I loved my clients. I quit my job. 8 months later, they caught the person that did it, was doing it, and had continued for another 8 months before they caught her.
Mm-hmm.
If I had it to do over again, I would have handled it a lot differently. I'd kick myself in the butt for not going further with it.
What would you have done?
I would have
differently?
kept going as far as I could go to report them. It's a facility that to this day is still running, and I have friends that still work there, and it still goes on.
You know,
But I'm not there, so I can't do any more reporting now, obviously.
You can always make a report.
I can?
You can always report after the fact. And in fact, if it wasn't reported, again, you're mandated to report.
It was hidden
that
under the
report.
carpet. It was hidden under the carpet, but it's a big, how can I say it, conglomerate business. It's a big
Mhm.
business. The person where this happened, and it was shoved under the carpet, and everybody involved was taken out of the place.
excuse me.
I was included. I quit before they had the chance to fire me. I told them I wasn't working for a facility like that. I refuse to work for them.
Well, not only Adult Protective Services, but again, Survey and Certification is also the agency or the part of our department that licenses those facilities. So they, we
I
often
could cry
do-
just thinking about it still to this day, and it's been like 5 years since it's happened. I still have a very hard time with it because I feel I let the person down because I didn't handle it properly. I wish now that I would have done differently than what I did. To this day, it haunts me because even though I was demoted and everything that happened to me, I wish now that I would have had better resources because I would have pushed it right to the max.
Well, hopefully going forward, again, we obviously hope you don't run into another situation
Oh,
like
God, I
that.
hope not ever.
But if you do, you'll know where
Now
you
I'll
can
know,
reach out to.
absolutely.
I was
Thank
told-
God for you, people, really.
Yeah. I was told that we could be prosecuted for not following up.
Well, that's what I always thought
We-
The
too.
situation
I
I
always
was
felt
in
the
was
same
that I
way.
had,
We will
I
be
had
getting to
reported
that.
something to my director of nursing,
Mhm.
again, a long time ago, and this,
Yeah.
and the director of nursing had not done anything.
Yeah.
And I was told later on that I had to be aware of the fact that nothing had happened, and because I hadn't gone above the director of nursing.
I did though. I
um,
went to the proper people,
yeah.
but they didn't do anything.
So that's, we do have to be, we are.
It's
I'm
scary.
sure not we have to be, but we
It's-
are worried about retribution.
Yes.
We have to be
Mhm.
conscious of the fact.
Yeah, and this
I
was
had-
in a facility.
I had a
This is
similar
how
thing
we
happen to
support-
me,
Yeah.
how
and
we
then
support
it just
ourselves.
continued to get worse.
Yeah, and they abuse you and they
Afterwards.
treat you badly, so you end up leaving anyway because
Yep.
they don't want you there because you've reported them.
Yep.
We will be getting to all of
Good.
Yeah, good, I hope so.
So
Awesome.
we do, again, we receive reports via fax and the new online form that we have, although we're still working out some bugs. We are happy to have it. If anyone had used our previous form, it was unfortunately not a secure form. There was no way to know when you hit submit if it ever actually made it to us. And when it was sent to us, we had to then print it out and then data enter all of that information into our system. That, of course, opens up for potential human error, and we transpose, one number, and all of a sudden we can't find the individual we need to because we've got their phone number or their address in there wrong. So this form, when you complete it and submit it, it goes directly into our database. We have timed it at under 30 seconds from when you submit it to when it is received by us. So we have the ability to look at that information and make a screening decision much faster. Especially if the report that you submit is complete, then we don't have the need to call you back, to play phone tag, to try and gather that information. We can have the information in front of us and get an investigator out there as quickly as possible or as appropriate. So, very excited about our new online form. However, there have been some hiccups. So if you're going to use the online form, you need to make sure that your pop-up blocker is turned off. Unfortunately, if you complete the form and you go to submit it, you will get a question, do you want to print this form? If your pop-up blocker is turned on, when you hit yes, I want to print it, it unfortunately disappears. So make sure that the pop-up blocker is turned off so that you can print a copy of that for your records. We have made a number of the fields on the report required. This again enables us to gather as much information as possible and eliminate the need to play phone tag, to try and connect with the reporter to gather more information. When all required fields are completed and we have a complete intake, again, we can protect the vulnerable adult much faster by getting an investigator or appropriate resources out there. Text box character limits. When filling out this online report, unfortunately we have determined that there are character limits on some of the text boxes, and unfortunately it does not tell you that until you have completed it. So as you can imagine, you have gone on and on with a very extensive story and you've been typing forever only to find out that you exceeded the limit and now all of your work is gone. So a way to avoid that, Given that you work with an agency where you are probably required to be documenting this in some other area as well, you do have the ability to attach documentation to the report. So just as you would attach a Word document or anything to an email, you have the ability to attach to this form. So you can, if you have to type this out and report it to a supervisor, you can attach that same report to this and save you a lot of time. Anonymous reports. Adult Protective Services does receive and can take anonymous reports. However, when we receive an anonymous report, especially if it's a report that's not complete, we don't have any way to gather more information, and that could prevent us from protecting that vulnerable adult. That said, Adult Protective Services investigators and staff are also bound by statute not to release the name of a reporter unless we are ordered to by a judge in a court proceeding linked to said report. So, when you're making a report to us, we are not allowed to release your information to anyone. Many people ask when doing these trainings with agencies if they are making a report to us, should they let the individual know that they're working with, that they're making the report. That is usually a decision that is more individual or is an agency policy. My feeling, again, with a social work background, is that as a mandated reporter, the individuals that you're working with should know that you are mandated to report allegations of abuse, neglect, and exploitation. Does that mean that you have to tell them when they're disclosing something to you? Not necessarily. But while you're working with them, when an agency or any mandated reporter is working with an individual or a family, there should be some conversation around the fact that things that are disclosed to me, things that I observe in your home, I am mandated to report if you feel they rise to the level of abuse, neglect, or exploitation.
I have a quick question.
Yep.
It's kind of a little off topic, I think, but don't they do specialized background checks for certain caregivers if they are paid for by an organization?
They do. So
How could they get around? Because I know, like us, we can't have any domestic assault, a felony, or anything like
Right.
that on us. How can an actual caregiver that's not licensed get around something like that?
well, a caregiver that's not licensed, that doesn't work for an agency, may not be required to do a background check.
I know that they were, but somehow it overpassed the felony and the domestic assault and being in jail for 7 years for it. So I was kind of curious about, yeah.
Facilities are required to do background
That's
checks.
scary.
They are required to do the criminal background check. They are required to do the background check of the child abuse and the vulnerable adult abuse registry. However, individuals can ask the Division of Licensing and Protection for a variance. They can ask that the agency that's hiring them overlook their past convictions.
Wow.
I agree with
That's
that sentiment.
scary.
I mean, even because it was a family member, I think that's why it got overpassed.
It could be.
But
I really, I don't, I'm not involved in the variance process, and I really don't know enough about it. But I can also tell you, not all caregivers work for an agency. Caregivers, unfortunately, individuals will advertise in 7 days on Craigslist looking for someone to come into their home and provide care for them. Those individuals do not go, unfortunately, through a background check
Right.
process.
And the
I
elderly
know.
person is at risk.
I know
Yes.
this one is employed by, it's an agency that works, it's almost like TLC.
Mm-hmm.
They go to different homes.
Which is even scarier.
Yeah. It's mainly home-based care.
So
that
they
they
are,
do.
if it's an agency that's providing care to vulnerable populations, they are required to do the background checks. However, again, there is the variance process, and there's, in some cases, depending on when they do the background checks, we'll talk a little bit about when we substantiate a perpetrator, the time frame between when we do that and when they may go on the registry, that this individual, could get a job in between there and a background check would come up clean. It doesn't sound like the background check on this individual should ever come up clean. So again, I would guess there's some other process at play there.
The person I was talking about, they just fired her, they never turned her in or anything. So she can go in another facility again.
Correct. It would be interesting to know that name.
Yeah.
So again, if you're submitting a report to us online, if you include an email address in that report for us, you will also receive an email which states that we've received your report, and it gives you a confirmation or a reference number so that if you had questions in the future or you had additional information to provide, you could call and just give us that number, and we would quickly be able to locate that and either enter the information that you are providing or give you an update on that report. So what should be included in a report? Again, the name, address, and phone number of the reporter. You can submit anonymous reports, but providing us with your contact information is very helpful. The names, addresses, and phone numbers of the vulnerable adult and anyone who is responsible for this person's care. If you are providing us with just the name of the alleged victim and possibly they don't have access to a phone, or the perpetrator lives with them, it may put that vulnerable adult at further risk if we're reaching out directly to them. If you know that they have a caregiver that is usually with them, maybe it's a community support or a community skills worker, maybe you know that they see a therapist every Thursday morning at 10. If you provide that information in the report that you're making, it allows our investigator to reach out to that victim in the best and safest scenario possible.
What if they don't have anybody else and they only have one sole provider that lives with them?
If they do that, then our investigators, we run into that every day as well. Our investigator is going to do the best to try and find a time when those individuals may be separated. We have used primary care doctors. We will ask when the next appointment is. If we know that it's not safe or it's going to put that individual at potential further risk, to approach them with the perpetrator there with them, then we will use any means that we can to try and interview them away from that perpetrator. However, we of course have to go into homes where it's the victim and the caregiver and that's it. We have to go in and we have to try and assess and try to separate them even just within the home in order to interview and assess the safety of that victim, and to see, if at least put eyes on and get other resources in there as quickly as possible. The age of the vulnerable adult and the nature of his or her disability. Again, we receive a number of reports that upon some further screening or investigation, we determine that the victim is actually 17 and then therefore doesn't meet our statutory threshold. So we just, even if you don't have the date of birth, if you have the date of birth, great, but just a roundabout age is very helpful. Mm-hmm. If you know that there is a diagnosis, if you know the nature of the disability, again, that is extremely helpful, because we do not have the statutory authority to investigate if we determine that the individual is not a vulnerable adult. So again, providing us with this information makes it much faster process for our screeners to determine that it's a vulnerable adult and that there's an allegation of abuse, neglect, or exploitation, and we need to get an investigator assigned. And then to include as much detail as possible regarding the suspected abuse, neglect, or exploitation, and including any evidence, documentation, or potential witnesses. I'm not asking you to do your own investigation. In fact, we would really prefer that you didn't. But when I say including evidence, if you go into a home and the individual discloses to you that they were physically abused and they have visible bruising, visible scratches, visible marks on their body, and they allow you, and your agency allows you, to take a photo of that, that can be extremely helpful. Even if we can get an investigator out there within 24 hours, that bruise could fade, that mark could be gone. If they are disclosing to you potential financial exploitation and they show you a copy of a canceled check that they know was forged, if they show you, any documentation that would be helpful, providing that to us if they would allow it, again, can be a huge step in our investigation. During the time between when you make the report or when they disclose something to you and when we get out there, the perpetrator could have gotten their hands on that documentation and destroyed it. It could disappear in any other way. So again, not asking you to do the investigation, but if you are presented with evidence and that alleged victim is okay with you taking a copy of that or taking a picture, again, that's extremely helpful to us. Any other potential witnesses, if you're making a report and you know, or if you've observed something that happened in the home, and there were other individuals there that may have witnessed this, other individuals who overheard this disclosure, again, it's helpful for us to know that because that could strengthen our case when we have multiple people that may have witnessed the event or heard the disclosure. So the failure to report. This is the part where I scare you and tell you I'm going to take your money if you don't make reports to us. There is an administrative penalty for mandatory reporters who do not make or cause a report to be made. There has been an agency within Chittenden County which was fined $10,000 for failing to report. So, as a mandated reporter, if you have the suspicion, if you have reason to believe that a vulnerable adult has been abused, neglected, or exploited, you have 48 hours to make that report to us. I know that there are some agencies that have policies in place that a supervisor is the one who needs to make the report. Mm-hmm. If that is a policy that your agency has in place, I would urge you to make sure that you're making that report to your supervisor and you are sitting with them to make the report to Adult Protective Services, or you're asking them for a copy of the report that was made so you can confirm that you caused a report to be made to APS. Because again, if you tell your supervisor, and again, I know that it may be the policy that they've set up for you, but if you tell your supervisor and the report is not made, it is still your responsibility, and you could be held accountable for not making that report.
So it is 48 hours, it's not 24?
It is 48. It's 24
So
hours.
I thought it was 24.
It's 24 for child abuse.
Ah.
Okay, because we had it at one of the facilities, they were saying it was 24, but it's 48.
It's 48
And
hours.
you want to do it as soon as you can, but sometimes time,
Yes, yes.
Okay.
48 hours is the cutoff
Okay.
for Adult Protective Services.
Okay.
But yes, as
And
soon as
where
possible
does
is.
children abuse get reported to?
Child abuse also has a 1-800 number.
Okay.
I used to know that right off the top of
That's
my head, and I don't
I think
anymore.
I have it in my car actually.
Okay.
211, as Tim was saying, is a good
Yeah.
resource and
Yeah.
a quick number that that most people can remember.
Mm-hmm.
So what happens when a report is made to us? Again, we talked about our two wonderful and extremely busy individuals who receive all reports. They are also responsible for screening all of those reports. The screening portion of the process could include a phone call back to the reporter for further information or clarification of the information provided. If you submit a report which is thorough, you probably won't receive a call back from our screeners because you provided all the information we need in order to determine if it is something that we should screen in and assign for investigation, or if it is something that does not meet our statutory requirements and definitions, and then we would be looking at what other potential referrals and resources should be available to this individual. So that is the decision portion. Again, are we going to be screening in the report and assigning it for investigation, or will it be screened out and closed and appropriate referrals made? As the reporter, you will receive a letter at the point of determination within 5 business days of when that decision and determination was made. The first letter that you would receive will let you know that either we have opened and assigned the report for investigation, or it will tell you that the report was not open for investigation and the following referrals were made. One of, unfortunately, the most difficult pieces of our statute is that if we receive a report about an individual and we do not open it for investigation, we are required by statute to send that individual a letter which states, we received a report that you were abused, neglected, or exploited, but we are not opening it for investigation. As you can imagine, that can be very confusing, very upsetting to an individual. Unfortunately, we are bound by statute to send such a letter. The investigation, if your report is open and assigned for investigation, you will hear from one of our investigators. They may ask you again the same questions that you answered in the intake, the same questions that our screener may have called back and asked you, but our investigator is looking at this possibly from a completely different angle. You may have information that you didn't provide that they have a way of teasing out of you. The investigator will contact any other pertinent witnesses if you included individuals in your report that may have witnessed the event or also were there for the disclosure of abuse, neglect, or exploitation. We have strict time frames in which we have to get eyes on the alleged victim and interview them and assure their safety. We will collect evidence, any documentation available regarding the alleged abuse, neglect, or exploitation, and then our investigators are responsible for documenting their findings and recommending a conclusion. At the conclusion of an investigation, as the reporter, you will also receive a letter. The determination at the end of either unsubstantiated, which means that there was potentially either insufficient evidence to prove that the abuse, neglect, or exploitation occurred, or that the available evidence showed that the allegation was not factual, that abuse, neglect, or exploitation did not occur. Other reasons for unsubstantiated, possibly we get out there and determine that the alleged victim is not a vulnerable adult, or we get out there, and this is something we'll touch on a little bit more, the individual is assessed to have decisional capacity and refuses adult protective services intervention and investigation. But again, you will receive that letter at the closure of our investigation. The other possible letter that you will receive will state that the investigation has been closed, and it was closed with a recommendation of substantiation, which means that after the investigation, it was determined and there was evidence to support that the report was based on factual and reliable information, and we are concluding that the abuse, neglect, or exploitation did in fact take place. So what can Adult Protective Services do? We can offer protective services, so that's good. They named us right. We will investigate the allegations of abuse, neglect, or exploitation of the vulnerable adult, and will provide protective services and or referrals to stop the abuse, neglect, or exploitation, and to hopefully prevent further abuse, neglect, or exploitation. As I just touched on, an adult who is determined to have the capacity to make their own decisions may refuse assistance from APS or any other social service organization, even if it means that they continue to be the victim of abuse, neglect, or exploitation. This is extremely frustrating. Unfortunately, we do see this often.
Oh, wow.
An adult who has decisional capacity, who has not been, found incompetent by a judge, or who does not have a diagnosis which would in some way prevent them from being able to make their own decisions. They can tell us, yes, I'm being abused in my home. Yes, my family member has taken all of my money and I don't have enough money for food or heat, or I'm losing my house because they took all of my money, but I don't want you to do anything about it. If they have been assessed to have decisional capacity and they tell us, I don't want you to do anything, we don't have
That
the
means you
right.
can't?
We do not have the right to proceed. That said, it doesn't mean that when an individual tells us, I don't want you to do anything, that our investigator says, great, I've got 2 free hours today. See you later. Nice meeting you. Our investigator is still going to discuss safety planning with them. Our investigator is still going to discuss other possible resources that even if they don't want us involved, the Council on Aging, for instance, if it's an issue of financial exploitation, we can still discuss with them, what they could do as far as their bank or financial institution to try and better protect the resources that they do have. But again, if they have decisional capacity and they say, I'm refusing to cooperate, get the heck out of my house, we unfortunately have to comply.
Yeah. Well, mine was in an Alzheimer's unit, so they're not gonna remember it even being done to them.
Exactly.
Unfortunately, that is the case.
Yeah. Scary.
So also, within the scope of APS, we can assist in petitioning for guardianship for the alleged victim. We also utilize relief from abuse orders, no trespass orders. The relief from abuse is more commonly known as a restraining order. We can utilize these in order to put some distance between the victim and perpetrator. We can request and review financial documentation. There's actually a bill in front of the Senate as we speak, which would give Adult Protective Services investigators the right to these financial documents when they are regarding the abuse, neglect, or exploitation of a vulnerable adult. It would also allow us access to medical records. Unfortunately, although in many instances we can get that information through a simple release from the vulnerable adult, if the perpetrator is the guardian, if the perpetrator is a power of attorney, they can at times block us from gaining access to that documentation. Of course, why would they want us to have it when it's going to prove what they've been up to? So hopefully that bill will pass and it will be one more tool for our investigators to protect vulnerable adults. We can mediate issues for the alleged victim with Social Security or with the Veterans Administration. We can request court documentation, police reports, or landlord contracts. We do actually at this point, our investigators have access to the Vermont courts system, so we do we can run our own background checks basically, which is a great tool not only in protecting the vulnerable adult but also our investigators. As do many of you, our investigators are going out to homes where we may not have any idea what's on the other side of that door. We have unfortunately had investigators that are met at the door with firearms.
Oh my God.
We have had investigators that are met at the door with large dogs. I had a run-in with an unbelievably nasty Chihuahua. Much rather the big dogs. So having these tools allows us to do some research before we go out, so that we can again protect ourselves and do anything that we can to make sure that we are safe, but also that the vulnerable adult is safe. We make many other referrals to other agencies as appropriate: the Office of Public Guardian, the Councils on Aging, victims advocates when appropriate, or many other social services providers and supports, designated agencies, mental health, developmental services, any of those, we can make those referrals. And when Adult Protective Services investigator substantiates against an alleged perpetrator, his or her name is placed on the Vermont Adult Abuse Registry, removing them from most paid caregiving jobs in Vermont. Again, we'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. And we do conduct joint investigations with law enforcement agencies when it appears that the abuse, neglect, or exploitation is criminal as well as a civil offense. The Title 13, Chapter 28 of Vermont's Criminal Code is nearly identical to Adult Protective Services Vulnerable Adult Statute. So we do a number of joint investigations with law enforcement because they do get to arrest people and throw them in jail when appropriate. Not within the scope of APS. Adult Protective Services investigators do not provide case management and are not able to provide ongoing casework or case management services to an individual once the investigation is completed. We do, however, make referrals as appropriate for case management services when needed. Investigators cannot provide transportation for alleged victims, and investigators are not appointed as payees or guardians. And when an investigator recommends substantiation of the alleged perpetrator, the individual has the right to appeal that decision, and the investigator at this point is not a party to that appeals process. So substantiation, again, the commissioner or the commissioner's designee has determined after the investigation that the report was based upon accurate and reliable information that would lead a reasonable person to believe that the vulnerable adult has been abused, neglected, or exploited, and the determination from our investigators is made on a preponderance of the evidence. So we don't need beyond a reasonable doubt, we just need a preponderance of the evidence, or as we look at it, 51%. So, with substantiation, our investigator finds that they believe the abuse, neglect, or exploitation took place. They recommend that the perpetrator be substantiated. Their supervisor agrees, and the report is submitted as a recommendation of substantiation. That perpetrator receives notice that we found that they abused, neglected, or exploited a vulnerable adult. That individual then has the right to appeal that decision. Unfortunately, the individual is not placed on the adult abuse registry until the appeals period has been exhausted, or until their appeals have been finalized and a final determination and finding has been made. The appeals process, when they first receive the letter that we would like to substantiate them, they have 15 days to request a appeal with our commissioner. If our commissioner upholds our recommendation of substantiation, the perpetrator then has 30 days from that time to appeal to the Human Services Board. If the Human Services Board upholds our finding, the individual can then appeal that decision all the way to the Vermont Supreme Court. Unfortunately, that means that it can be upwards of a year until the appeal is finalized, meaning, as we discussed, that individual could continue working with vulnerable populations, could work in a different facility during that time, and until their name is placed on the registry. One of the loopholes, or one of the cracks, unfortunately, is that if that perpetrator bounces from place to place and we can't keep track of where they're working, even though they're placed on the registry, if that agency, that organization doesn't do annual or regular background checks, that individual may continue to work with vulnerable populations. If, however, we are able to keep track of where that individual is working, once their name is placed on the registry, and these phone calls are fun, we can tell that agency that they've been placed on the registry and they should do another background check. So again, when the investigator recommends substantiation, if after the appeals process is completed, the substantiation determination is upheld, they are added to the adult abuse registry. I have not seen this happen yet, but I hope to soon. The perpetrator can be fined up to $10,000 for abuse, neglect, or exploitation of a vulnerable adult. And the commissioner shall notify, has the right to notify, and will notify the Office of Professional Regulation or any other professional licensing board applicable to the violator. However, Office of Professional Regulation, medical practice boards, Medicaid fraud, law enforcement, all of those agencies have much larger windows and time frames for their investigations. Our investigators at this point are tasked with completing their investigation in a maximum of 90 days. That is a really quick turnaround.
Wow.
The majority of the other professional investigative agencies have a minimum of a year to complete their investigations. So if we're doing an investigation and we know that our perpetrator has a professional license, we're going to get that professional licensing board and their investigator involved as quickly as possible in hopes that their investigation will move along faster. We've been talking about how long it can take to get someone on the registry and keep them from working with vulnerable populations. Medical Practice Board, Office of Professional Regulation, they have the ability to suspend licenses or to revoke licenses and prevent that individual from harming another vulnerable adult in a much faster, cleaner process. Any questions? We've covered a lot of information.
I have a question.
Sure.
What is there out there for the caregiver? Because the facility I've been talking about has bullying amongst caregivers. If you say you turn somebody in, then that caregiver gets bullied by all the other caregivers. What is there out there to protect the caregiver from the facility, the person running the facility, and the caregivers? Is there anything out there for the caregiver?
I am not.
Because I know the place I'm
familiar.
talking about has had a lot of bullying amongst the caregivers on other caregivers.
The Division of Licensing and Protection, the survey and search side, I am sure that within their regulations would be some protection for appropriate and professional behavior amongst caregivers and amongst employee and supervisor.
Okay.
But again, I'm not
Right.
100% familiar with all of their regulations.
Right.
But that is definitely where I would head them first
Okay.
for
I was
support.
curious about that, if there was anything out there for them.
Yes.
Okay.
In actuality, there's very little,
I know.
very little. It's, in other states, it's not quite as bad as Vermont, but there's a definite, you're guilty until proven innocent in the state of Vermont, as
yeah.
opposed to you're innocent until proven guilty in many other licensing areas.
Yeah.
I've been a traveler my entire nursing career, and I've worked under many states' licensing boards.
And you've probably seen that.
And well, Vermont is by far the most adversarial
Ah,
in the United States in terms of assumption of guilt on the part of
Right, right.
professional
right,
license holders.
yeah.
That's really, it's just the way
The way it is.
it's
Well,
done.
In
Vermont.
discussing abuse, neglect, and exploitation of a vulnerable adult, from where I sit, I would argue that the perpetrator actually has much more protections than the victim does. So I think maybe from the medical practice or licensing boards that's the case, but from an investigative standpoint and from our statute, the victim doesn't have the right to appeal over and over and over again. The perpetrator has to, has 3 different appeals.
And you
and
said
the-
right up to the Supreme Court, you
Right.
said.
Yeah.
So I would say that they are innocent until proven guilty 3 times.
Yeah. Yeah.
My point was that you have very little recourse within the licensing board. I mean, because this is your livelihood,
Mm-hmm.
and if your license is revoked, there's no, I mean, there goes all of your
That's it,
resources in terms of.
Yeah.
So I'm glad that, I think it's good that victims are protected.
Mm-hmm.
But I was addressing a specific question. Is there anything in
About the
place to
caregiver, for the
protect the
caregivers.
caregiver?
Yeah.
And in point of fact, there's very little
Yeah.
in the state of Vermont. Really, there needs just needs to be fairness in both directions. There needs to be adequate investigation.
Mm-hmm.
It looks like there's quite a bit of investigation set up within Adult Protective Services. You've listed quite a bit.
Yeah.
Often there isn't, I mean, your only resource is court suing.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
And if you're in that situation, you should threaten to use it vigorously from the instant that something, I mean, if you feel like somebody says you've done something, you're abusing a patient, and you're not, you should.
Well, you definitely should
hit
fight
them.
it. Absolutely.
Well, but what I mean is you can't assume that somebody is going to give you the benefit of the doubt.
Right. Right.
You can't assume that your director of nursing or the board of nursing is going to approach this with the idea that you might not have done it. That it might have been a mistake or an error or jealousy or
Mhm.
anger, some other reason.
But a lot of times, I think it's just brushed under the carpet.
And it's also important, to note that if you're working in a facility and there's an allegation made, there are regulations regarding what the facility has to do
Right.
to protect that resident. So even if, and believe me, we've seen this, even if the facility knows that this allegation is false, they still may, depending on the regulation, depending on their licensure, they may have to suspend that individual, that caregiver, until their internal investigation is completed.
Until I know for sure.
Right. So they have. I don't think that it's always saying you're guilty. It could be they have to show that they are protecting the residents and that they are following their regulation, even if they know that it's a false allegation.
Yeah, because the main goal is the elderly person. That's the way it should be.
Right.
What if they're on a dementia unit where the allegation has been made and they say, well, we asked the resident and the resident said that didn't happen, but you have to move out this unit, and that person that apparently did the
Gets to stay there.
abuse gets to stay there.
Yeah.
How would that work? And then, according to that person, they got a letter in the mail saying that it was a lapse in judgment from the state of Vermont.
Those are difficult situations.
There's a lot of loopholes.
There are
Mhm.
there are
I've never
potential
dealt
for
with that.
loopholes, but also there are regulations and there's statute, and sometimes the two don't mesh well.
Because I think it was like 3 or 6 months later, they fired him for abuse after the fact.
Yeah, but in the meantime,
But
he
it
got
was a
abused.
different set of abuse charges.
Yeah, but in the
on a different
meantime, he got
resident.
to continue doing what he was doing to the poor people.
Exactly.
That's the sad thing.
Yep.
It is.
Yep. I mean, I had been there for like a year, and they had just come in and just started, and this happened. And she's like, "Oh, well, you have to move units," and I ended up getting written up. And it's just like, I couldn't believe it. It's crazy.
You were trying to do your job properly, and you're the one that got.
Yeah, they also
In
told me
trouble.
that I had 24 hours to report. Both me and the nurse went and reported it at the same time, and it was within that 24 hours. But they never got it to, I'm suspecting it's APS, be within that 24 hours. So then they said, well, you didn't report it within 24 hours, so now you're written up.
Yeah.
So the facilities also have very strict reporting guidelines, and they have to report a number of things even beyond abuse, neglect, and exploitation. And I do know that there are a number of facilities that have been fined and have received deficiencies for not reporting in a timely manner. So I know that that's on the licensing of the survey and certification side, that they have not only the mandated reporting, but they also have regulations around reporting.
Well, I know we had called her earlier, and she's like, well, I don't want to hear it. I'll
So
talk
you
to
went
you
through
in
the
the
same thing
morning.
I did, pretty much.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
it's sad.
They
So
never
again, I
suspended
would-
that person or anything.
No, they didn't on my end either.
I would urge that I think it gets very tricky, and it gets very dangerous for the individual when agencies have in place that a supervisor is the only one that can make reports. I would urge you, again, that if your agency has that policy, that you sit with the individual and make that report, or that you make the report and let your supervisor know, I made this report, here's a copy of what I reported. If you need to report it as well, please do so. But in some way to protect yourself, because again, you are the mandated reporter. You are also, even if your supervisor is the one that, even if they do make the report, we're going to ask, we want to speak to the person who witnessed the incident. We want to speak to the person who the disclosure was made to. We don't want to get
Right.
second, third-hand information. So we're still going to end up asking to speak to the individual.
And you can't say, oh, I told my director of nursing.
Right.
I reported it. You can't, you have to know that it kept going.
Well, when you go to your supervisor, the person that you're supposed to go to report these things, you assume that they're
Of course.
taking the proper
Yeah.
procedures.
But if they don't, it's
But
your fault.
in the facility I worked in, you're not allowed to just sit there. I had to go back to work. You're not allowed to just sit there and, well, I'm going to sit here while you do what you got to do. We weren't allowed to do that.
Yeah.
So I
you
would
just need to follow up, right?
again, and I think that's why you have the 48 hours.
Right.
So again, you can use the web intake. It's available 24 hours. You can, when you do have a chance, submit it. You can call, although again, because we can't release information regarding reports that came to us, you could call and say, I want to make sure that a report was made on this incident. Although we can't tell you if it was or it wasn't,
Right.
you're going to know, because if there wasn't a report made, we're going to continue asking you questions.
Exactly.
We're going to try and get that
Right.
information.
Right.
If the report was made, we may ask something like, do you have additional information regarding this that you would like to add? So, you're going to
So we just gotta
know.
remember those key questions that you ask.
Right.
Well, again, we're not able to tell you if a report has been made, but
Right.
through the conversation, you're
You're
going
gonna
to
know.
You're
We're gonna know
know.
yes or no.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
See, where it's, the rule was you reported it to the nurse or, and then they did their own
Yeah.
investigation.
Your supervisor.
And
the person
then
over you.
lots of times, well, we got all the facts and it wasn't, what it was made out.
So-
But that, it's all switched
That
hands
does
now,
get-
but that was what the rule
Right.
was. And then they would do their own investigation and then.
And I
could
know
go-
that it gets very tricky in facilities
So.
because licensed facilities are required to do their own internal
Right.
investigation
Mhm.
from the survey and certification side.
Right.
We would prefer on the APS side that they don't do that internal investigation until we've done ours. Because that allows, we have a facility right now, that it allowed they allowed the two individuals involved to continue working together. They had 3 days before a report was ever made to us to work together, to build their story,
Yeah.
to make sure that they were on the same page. Unfortunately, they weren't very good at that. Well, fortunately for us and
Right.
for the victim's family. But it would be better on the APS end if the internal investigation portion of regulations didn't kick in until after the report was made.
I agree, totally.
Any other questions, scenarios that you wanted to run by me? Concerns? All right, well, we do have this lovely little quiz that Alan put together.
Yeah.
Again, I think you will find all of the information available to you, and hopefully we touched on all of it.
Are we graded?
Oh, and also because I turned the person in and we're at this facility, I can no longer work there at all. I can't go in the doors. I'm not allowed in the
That's-
place.
Well, maybe
Yeah,
that's a
I-
positive.
Yeah, it is.
All right, let's find out how to turn this off.
Little button that you push.
Yeah, there was a
Stop
little.
button right there.